The Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor joins me. Angus Taylor, thanks for your time. The RBA board meets again tomorrow. Let's start with the issue of inflation and rates. Will they take some heart from the fact that core inflation was down by more than the expectations in the recent inflation data? Does it provide any sort of comfort?
Well, sadly, Kieran, and thanks for having me, but sadly, Kieran, inflation here in Australia is the highest amongst the major nations in the G7 in the world. 6.6% core inflation. That's ahead of the US, the UK, Canada, the Euro area, Italy and so on. So we are in a dire situation on this. This is not inflation that's coming from Russia or the Ukraine. This is inflation that is homegrown. It's coming from Canberra. It's Labor's inflation, and we need to see a budget that is going to deal with it head on. Now, Labor talks the talk, they say all these words like restraint, and yet we see the exact opposite in reality. $115 billion spendathon at the last budget. Who knows what it's going to be at this budget? And any spending cuts they want to make is productive infrastructure investment. They've got their priorities all wrong. These are the priorities of a typical big spending traditional Labor government dressed up as something else, but that's what we're seeing, and I certainly hope for the best in this budget, but I do fear for the worst. The Reserve Bank has to work within that context. They're an independent Reserve Bank, and I'll leave that to them.
If the Treasurer gets somewhere near a surplus, maybe a narrow deficit off the back of the windfall commodity prices again at this budget, that would be a fair way in the direction of what you're talking about and would be welcomed by the RBA, wouldn't it?
Well, there's no question that if the Treasurer wants to deliver a surplus in this budget, he'll be able to deliver a surplus. I mean, we've seen surpluses in recent months. In fact, he inherited a budget that from the opening up of the economy back in November of 2021 through to May when they took power after the election, the budget was in surplus. Now, the truth is this is not a Treasurer who wants to do that because he's going to be held to it again into the future. I mean, and that's the sad reality. But if they want to do it, they could do it. There's no question about that. The truth is with this kind of commodity income inflow, the strength of the job market, really they should be delivering a very significant structural surplus, but I fear that's not what we're going to see. What we are seeing, though, is calls from Labor ministers, calls from backbenchers for Labor to spend more money, and that is what we've always traditionally seen from Labor governments, and it's reverting to type.
On that inflation question you touched on earlier, the core inflation, you mentioned the G7 nations are all lower than what we have at the moment, but more broadly, as an issue, it is a global phenomenon right now, isn't it? Inflation and the battle that central banks are facing right around the world.
But we're the worst in the G7, Kieran. I mean, it's as simple as that. You know, I'm here with Aaron Violi, the hard-working local member here in Coldstream, where I'm standing right now. We've been out talking to businesses, and the very clear message coming through is they're seeing this inflation. It's hurting them, their businesses and their customers critically. Their customers are being very careful with their money, and they're having to be because this inflation is absolutely raging. It's inflation that's homegrown. It's inflation that belongs to Labor, and it's inflation that the Prime Minister said he would take responsibility for many times before the election. We need to see a budget where they don't just talk the talk, they walk the walk. I mean, we've got a Treasurer who talks a lot, gives us a lot of commentary, a lot of forecasting, but the truth is he doesn't deliver a plan that's putting downward pressure on inflation, and we're seeing that in the outcomes. As I say, the worst in the G7.
If it does get close to surplus or a narrow deficit, do they deserve credit for that budget discipline?
Well, they need to deliver budget surpluses over the forwards. I mean, it's a very simple formula, and we deployed this from 2013 to 2019. You make sure you're growing your economy faster than you're spending, Kieran. It's that simple, and then make sure that spending, as much of it as possible, is in productive investment like the infrastructure pipeline of over $100 billion, making sure that those investments are supporting local communities to grow, not slashing productive infrastructure investments. We've just heard that it looks like the Canterbury Road upgrade right near here has been delayed. I mean, these are the sorts of decisions Labor's making because it's spending money, it wants to spend money, a lot of money, $115 billion at the last budget, but on things that aren't going to take pressure off inflation, on things that aren't productive investments, and I feel we'll continue to pay the very high price we're paying right now for this very high level of inflation.
The Infrastructure Minister, as you alluded to, has made some announcements today on a review on infrastructure. Isn't that exactly what you're arguing for, though, to make sure that the spend is as productive as possible and not wasted on projects which simply don't provide or add to that productivity?
Well, I feel what we're going to see is another review. I mean, there's just reviews everywhere right now, hiring hundreds of new public servants, thousands of new public servants to do all these reviews in Canberra. This is a Canberra-led government, let's face it, so that Labor can focus on their pet projects. I mean, sadly, that's the reality of, I think, what we're seeing. The truth is I have no idea what the infrastructure investment is going to be in the coming years. There's no doubt inflation's running hard, but government revenues are running faster than inflation. So Labor can use this money well if they want to. They should be managing it very, very carefully. They certainly shouldn't be raising taxes. They should be taking red tape off businesses, particularly small businesses like where I'm here today and what I'm seeing today. And they should be capable, more than capable, of running budget surpluses and making sure that the economy is growing faster than spending.
One of the areas where there's been a massive blowout, and I think the former government has a bit of accountability on this front as well as the NDIS, and my colleague Andrew Clennell reporting that companies, some of the markups, they're overcharging by as much as 1,000%. In one case, a product charged $169.99 for a seat, a shower seat. It's being charged $1,150 for a similar product by a supplier under the NDIS. That's 1,000% markup, essentially. What's your reaction to that?
Look, we all want to see an NDIS which is sustainable, Kieran. It's absolutely crucial. Both sides of politics want to see this. We reached out to Labor when we were a government. We've reached out again since we've been in opposition to say we want to work with you on a bipartisan basis to make sure it is sustainable. We sent that message very loudly at the budget in reply speech after the last budget, and the message is still there. We want to work with you to make the NDIS sustainable. We are committed to it, and we know there's real challenges with that sustainability, and the kind of example you've just given is an example of those challenges.
Do the suppliers have to take a bit of a rap here as well, a bit of accountability, because this is blatant gouging?
Well, it's the first I've heard of that example, but what I do know is that there are challenges to sustainability. The best way to address that is to have both sides working together. We attempted to do that when we were in a government. Labor showed no interest. They've continued to show very little interest in working with us on this, but that offer remains and it will remain.
Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor will speak to you soon in the lead up to the budget. Thanks.
Good on you. Thanks, Kieran.